Okay, hello everyone, this is Mr. Rob Roden here again, and in this video we're gonna go over all of the crazy ways Gato can mix up and pressure his opponent, and trust me, there are a lot. So we're gonna go through the list of options based on what the opponent is doing when you're pressuring them, whether they're sitting still and blocking, whether they're mashing or jumping. Gato has options to all of them, so we're gonna start with if the opponent is just patiently sitting there and blocking. Okay, so the first option you have, the opponent is just sitting there very patiently while you're attacking them and block, is doing your light punch stomp into your light punch dash follow-up. Obviously this whole setup situation is quite a gimmick and it can be interrupted of course, but if your opponent lets you get away with it, you get a overhead that is very advantageous on block and free jump-ins on command. The next option you have is obviously going for the command grab follow-up, which is your heavy punch off of the punch stomp. Now, unfortunately, you can't link into the command grab off of the light stomp because there's too much hit stun and he doesn't jump high enough. So the only time you're going to be able to link into your command grab is off of a whiffed light stomp like this, which works well as a mix-up because then it's a whiffed button, so it's like a fake out but then goes into a command grab, so expecting to block the stomp and then they get hit by a grab. Pretty good mix-up. Or if you're near the corner, any string into your heavy stomp into the command and grab will connect, obviously, if the opponent doesn't jump. The next great option against a blocking opponent is using the kick stomp starter and then using the heavy punch follow-up, which is a dive kick. And when used at low heights, the dive kick is actually advantageous on block. As you can see there, it's slightly plus. So when you can link this sequence super easily off of any situation, you can always have a full block string that ends completely advantageous, which is really amazing, because Gato's got some great buttons. He's got a good standing light kick, a really good sweep, so he's probably going to win at this distance where it's slightly advantageous, and that's really good. And not only is the dive kick advantageous on block, it's also an overhead, so if the opponent is accidentally crouching, they will get hit by the dive kick, and then obviously if they get hit by the dive kick, he's even more advantageous than he would have been on block. So this is one of your best and safest pressure sequences, because it's plus on block, and there's nothing the opponent can do to interrupt it except for going for a DP, but that is risky when we get into the other options he has later. And the last and possibly best option Gato has against blocking opponents is just general mix-ups. So as we mentioned, he has the ability to go into an overhead with the dive kick, but he also has the ability to go into a low with this slide. And varying the timing on these can make for really good overhead low mix-ups. Gato can delay the dive kick so much that it can be hard to tell whether the slide or the dive kick is going to come down. Which is pretty powerful and pretty scary in even the slightly laggiest online environment. Pretty hard mix-ups to block, and that's not it. So obviously, the most of the time in this situation, you're probably going to be going for the dive kick, because as we've mentioned, the dive kick can even be advantageous on block. So the dive kick is obviously the far more, less risky option to go for, but the slide is great for going in of a low. But the mix-ups don't end there. If you amplify the stomp intro, you get some crazy cross-ups as well. So if you do the amplified kick stomp and do the sweep afterwards, the sweep will cross up, and it's a cross up low. And not only is it just a cross up low, it's also a cross up low that starts combos. So if I have Isla blocking and pretend she was blocking a whole sequence and then I go for the low, I get to combo into DPs, into a super, whatever I want, and I get a big chunk of damage because I did a cross up low, which is pretty crazy. And so you have the option of doing a same side overhead, a same side low, a cross up low that starts combos, and finally a fake cross out, which is probably the sneakiest and most evil of them all. So I can go for a situation that makes it look like I'm going to go for the cross up low into a combo, but I can actually do this, where I switch back onto the same side and the slide animation comes out slightly. So this is practically impossible to react to, and in order to do this you need to use the amplified punch stomp, and then use the heavy kick follow-up, and off of it you can get some nice stuff like this. Whoops. And the last mix-up is if the opponent is super patient and they're just waiting for you to do all your stuff, you can do an empty hop, jump in, and with any of your light buttons, and it'll leave you so close to the opponent that you can just mash grab. So to recap, against a blocking opponent, you can either get a command dash in for a very advantageous overhead jump in, you can go for a command grab, you can go for an overhead with your dive kick, you can go for an advantageous dive kick, you can go for a low with your slide, you can go for a cross-up low with your slide that starts combos, and you can go for a reverse cross-up, and also just for an empty jump into a throw. So on a blocking opponent, pretty scary already. So up next, what works if your opponent is just mashing jump to get out of your pressure, because jumping does beat a bunch of his things, like his projectile on the floor gets beaten by jump, obviously the command grab gets beaten by jump, and his slide gets beaten by jump, so a lot of his mix-up gets neutered by jump. So what mix-ups does Gato have to beat that? Well, first of all, almost every other option beats a jump. So things that beat a jump include going for the aerial dash in, because he'll dash in before the opponent probably presses a button, so he'll be able to anti-air them with his dash in. If you go for a parry, you can if you go for the light kick parry follow-up, he still has time to anti-air the opponent, and if they do press a button in the air, it will parry their button. Obviously, the high-hitting anti-air kick will also work against jumping opponents who try to jump out of your mix-ups. Going for a dive kick will also beat anyone jumping. So if the opponent is trying to jump out of your mix-ups constantly, a lot of your options let you either anti-air or punish the opponent in some way for doing so. Now, if your opponent is mashing buttons on block while you are pressuring them, the punch follow-up aerial dash in is a bit of a 50-50. It depends on what button the opponent is mashing, obviously, and even with things like standing buttons, depending on the timing, there are ways that he can get over it sometimes, but it's a bit risky. The parry is also obviously designed to beat people who are mashing. And it works against basically any button or aerial button the opponent can press, so it's very powerful, and has barely any recovery. The light punch follow-up off of the Kickstarter, the weird projectile that we haven't talked about yet, is something that works against mashes. At any point when Gato is in the air, he can throw this projectile, and no matter how high he is or how far from the opponent he is, as long as the trajectory is right, he'll hit the opponent instantly with this projectile and can interrupt any mashing. Once again, one of the favorite options, the dive kick will also beat mashing. If the opponent's trying to mash, they'll get hit by the latest frames of an instant dive kick, which is the dive kick that was advantageous on block. So the advantageous dive kick is also really good against mashers and jumpers. Now, even if the opponent is mashing DP, Gato still has some good answers. Fortunately, the punch follow-up off of the kick stomp actually puts Gato in a position where he dodges most DPs and works especially well against Islas with her movement throughout her DP. where basically the DP will always miss at the angle the Gato is, and he'll be able to get a punish either way. And basically any of the follow-ups off of his heavy stomp, whether it's his heavy punch or his heavy kick stomp, will let you punish a DP, because anything you do into a heavy stomp will basically go over a DP before the DP can come out, so then he can just run up and get a punish. He can even get, on Isla for example, he can get a blowback. So I believe that basically encompasses the any answer the opponent can have to a powerful mix-up scenario, whether they're just standing there and blocking, trying to play reactively, trying to block your mix-ups or cross-ups, whether they're trying to mash on buttons or try to jump out of your mix-ups, or they're just trying to mash a DP to get the hell out of there. Gato has options, and a lot of his options work against multiple things. So I'll just quickly recap all of his options and what works against what in a mix-up scenario. So, the punch follow-up of the punch stomp is the dash-in. The dash-in works well against people who are trying to play reactively and blocking, because if they sit there too patiently, he'll be able to get free jump-ins that are very advantageous and overhead, and that is very scary mix-up if they let you do that. It also works against opponents who try to jump out of your pressure, because you're able to anti-air them before they press their buttons. It can possibly sometimes work against mashing, but it's a little bit risky. And that's about it. So the aerial command dash is really good against opponents who try to block things a little bit too much and play a little bit too patiently and reactively, and also against people who are a little bit too trigger happy on the jump button. The heavy punch follow-up of the heavy punch stomp is the command grab, and it's very good for people who are playing reactively as well. If they're sitting there and blocking, it's very likely that they'll get hit by the command grab, because there's fake outs into the command grab, and that's the only real scenario where the command grab's going to work. Any jumping or mashing or DP is going to beat the command grab, but the command grab is the staple of mix-up for blocking opponents. The light kick follow-up off of the punch stomp is the parry, and the parry is obviously very good against characters who are trying to mash against you when you're pressing your buttons. It doesn't work against DPs, and it can also work against jumping opponents, because even if the opponent doesn't press a button when they jump, you are able to anti-air them in time before they land, and if the opponent does press a button when they jump, you will parry that jump button. So it works really well against people who are mashing or jumping. The heavy kick follow-up off of the punch stomp I find is only really useful for fake cross-ups, where it looks like you're jumping over the top of the opponent, but then he jumps backwards through the opponent, and then you can get a reverse, a double mix-up cross-up. I find that is the only real use for this button, so it is only really good for players who are playing very reactively and sitting there and blocking very patiently, because it's almost impossible to see this mix-up coming and block it consistently. The punch follow-up off of the kick stomp is the projectile, and it works really well against players who are mashing. Players who are mashing from a distance is included. And also it's surprisingly good against almost any DP in the game. The angle that DPs go at, somehow the projectile just always misses it, so if you throw it early or even late, you'll somehow go over DPs and manage to dodge them and punish them, so it's pretty cool at doing that. So it's good for characters who are mashing on buttons, or even mashing on DP most of the time. The heavy punch follow-up off of the kick stomp is the dive kick, and the dive kick is good for almost any scenario. It can be used on block instantly after the heavy kick starter, and get a very low dive kick to be advantageous on block to keep your block strings very safe, so safe that they're advantageous, so it's still your turn. And it is also an overhead, so it's slightly a mix-up, especially if you delay it and delay it enough to make it a mix-up with the low. And it also works against characters who are jumping or mashing. So the dive kick works against blocking opponents for two reasons. It's advantageous, it can be used as a pressure tool or a mix-up tool because it's an overhead. It works against people who are mashing buttons and people who are mashing on the jump button. So it works in almost any scenario except for a DP. And the heavy kick follow-up from the kick stomp starter is your slide, and it hits low, so obviously it works as a mix-up tool, so it's good against opponents who are playing patiently and trying to block against you, playing reactively and stuff. But it isn't good against much else. People can mash you out of it, people can DP out of it, and they can jump out of it. But it is quite good as a mix-up tool, not only for the fact of the normal version just being a low is good mix-up with the dive kick, it can also be a cross-up low, so it's a double powerful mix-up. It has two ways it can be a really awesome mix-up, and it can also start combos if it's amplified. So the heavy kick follow-up is good only for mix-ups on patient blocking opponents. And the final option is a heavy light stomp, can be just left empty and no follow-ups, and then you can go for a grab afterwards. This is obviously only good against very patient and reactive opponents who are trying to react to the things you do. Then you go for a grab and you can catch them for trying to be patient. It won't work against mashers or DPers or jumpers, so only use it against very patient opponents. The light kick follow-up off of the kick stomp is your anti-air kick. It obviously works really well against characters who or opponents who really like to jump out of your pressure because they're really scared of your mix-ups and your grabs and things. So it works very consistently in that situation. But it doesn't work against mashers or DP mashers or people who sit there and block, because it won't be too useful in any of those scenarios. So the light kick follow-up is mainly just used for anti-airing the opponent if you're using it in block sequence, but just a little side note, it's also really useful for combos. Okay, and that concludes this mix-up guide for Gato. He obviously has a ton of options when it comes to pressure and mix-ups, and I hope this guide was helpful in consolidating all of the options that he has so you have a really good understanding of what to use when and how to really efficiently mix your opponent up. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.